I call David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And may I just begin by responding to one or two of the points made by this member who just been sharing his wisdom with us. I agree that there have been some positive moves made by this government, particularly around corrections. The notion that every inmate, as they enter prison, will receive some screening for alcohol and drug issues, problems, dependence, whatever. The idea of a needs assessment when people go into prison, that's positive and long overdue. The provision of meaningful work in all of our prisons for those inmates who choose to do it. Programs around rehabilitation and reintegration. These are all good things, but unfortunately what we are seeing is a lot of rhetoric about them, but very little investment. We spend something like $1.4 billion on corrections, and a minuscule part of that budget is being committed to these quite positive changes. Drug and alcohol assessment on entry to prison. We simply don't have the people skilled and experienced to do that, and nor are we investing in creating that pool of people who can do that very positive work. So I do commend some of the changes on paper, but now we need to put the investment, reinvest the justice dollar into actually putting these things into practice in a meaningful way. And I look forward to the member's support within his party to see that that investment is made. So returning to the Parole Amendment Bill, the Greens have tried hard to like this bill since it was introduced, but unfortunately we find it's flawed, that it's part of the flaw. I guess the fundamental flaw is that it was introduced as a reaction to some very noisy vocal minorities who are calling, ideally from their point of view, for an abolition of parole. The simplistic and completely adrift notion that we should actually do away with parole completely. And I fear this bill is essentially a political response to try and placate those people. And sir, in defence of parole, I would quote the former chairperson of the New Zealand Parole Board, the 2012 annual report of the Parole Board, headed at that point by, get this right, Judge Sir David Carruthers, who said, and I quote, "The most important reason for a parole board lies in the fact that the international research shows that managed release on parole with a right of recall back to prison during the term of a sentence is about 4 times more effective in preventing reoffending than automatic release at the end of the term of imprisonment." So parole, actually releasing people back to the community with conditions, with management, with monitoring, is vastly superior to this flawed notion of simply make them stay in prison up until the last minute of the last day of their sentence. So what this bill does, of course, is to increase the permissible time between parole hearings to allow for the increase in the maximum term of a postponement order from 3 to 5 years. And again, a number of speakers on this bill have talked about this giving the parole board more flexibility. In fact, the board already has some flexibility where they see that a particular individual is almost certain not to get parole. They can, there's I think Section 27 from memory allows for postponement orders. There are existing mechanisms that can fulfil the aims of this legislation. What this bill does is to create a mechanism where inmates can apply to have a parole hearing subject to completion of relevant activities, and that is seen as a positive thing. However, it assumes that inmates know their rights, are able to articulate them, are literate enough to read the legislation to understand what their rights are around these. And unfortunately, the profile of a standard inmate in our prisons does not match that person who's literate, confident, and able to assert their rights. We know that some of the relevant activities, that is the milestones, so we're discouraged from using that word, that prisoners must meet to be considered for a parole hearing under this new rule, could include things like group or individual counselling, literacy work, drug or alcohol programs, work training. These are all good and positive things and should be readily available to inmates. But the reality is that they're not. They're not now, and we have no reason to expect that they will be sufficiently available in the future. We had one excellent submission from one Sue Shon, a parole lawyer, came to the committee in March of last year, with a couple of very good case studies of inmates who were motivated to get themselves onto parole, who were doing all the right things, but who for very sound and understandable reasons were not getting access to these to some of these programs. One inmate who was required to do group counselling pointed out that if he was obliged to do group counselling, that would put him at considerable risk. He was endeavouring to extract himself from a gang. Group counselling would oblige him to publicly and in front of other inmates state his ambition to get away from the gang, which actually would put him in considerable danger. There were other similar examples presented to us of inmates who had the goodwill, the motivation, but simply were not getting access to the programs that the parole board was keen for them to do, that the inmates themselves were keen for them to do, and that could have led to their release on parole and ultimately their reintegration. Unfortunately,
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. The time has come for me to leave the chair for the dinner break. This debate is interrupted and I shall resume the chair at 7:30.